the law, it is fitting that I begin my presentation by focusing the first part on what is easily the most prominent historical example of the real-world implications of the question before us. And I mean the case of Teresa Marie Schiavo, in which I was involved as a civil rights attorney. And having examined this case very briefly, I will, in parts 2 and 3 of this talk, situate it within the context of the origin and nature of the current theological political crisis in Western civilization. I'm going to go down into the metaphysical engine room of political modernity, and there I'm going to make some rash and very probably heretical observations about the American founding and what it means for the problem that we're addressing. And finally, in the last part of the talk, I'm going to offer some suggestions for a radically Catholic, and I mean radically, response to what Pope Benedict has rightly called the dictatorship of relativism. Let's talk first of all about the case of Teresa Marie Schiavo. And it began on March 31st, 2005 at 9:05 a.m. when Teresa died at a hospice in Pinellas County, Florida. 13 days after the standard peg feeding tube that had supplied her with food and water was disconnected for the third and last time by the order of a Florida probate judge. And over that 13-day period, Teresa slowly starved and dehydrated to death, while Catholics and other Christians, and even people of no faith around the world, protested, prayed, and waited for the end. Father Frank Pavone of Priests for Life was with Teresa until 10 minutes before her death, and he later recounted how Teresa's brother and sister spent their last visit with her, and I'm quoting, caressing her and assuring her also of the prayers and concern of so many people around the world. And in earlier visits with Teresa, Father Pavone had observed that, and I'm quoting, she was very responsive, closing her eyes when I said, "Let's pray together," to her, opening them after the prayer, smiling, returning the kiss of her father, turning her eyes to me when I spoke to her, in many other ways as well responsive. Even on the last day of her life, as that life was ebbing away from the lack of sustenance, Teresa's eyes, and I'm quoting again, were open. Her eyes were moving. And as I prayed with her, her eyes were shifting over toward my direction, even until the last moments that I was with her. And when asked to comment on the claims of expert physicians that all of this behavior was reflexive, Father Pavone replied, "Certainly amazingly timed reflexes. I'll give the doctors the benefit of their own expertise, but this raises, of course, the deeper moral issue. Give them what they are saying. What does that mean? That someone at a lower level of functioning can just be starved to death? That, of course, is the bigger question here. This is not just a death, this is a killing. Terry didn't die today from anything except the fact that her food and water were withheld for the last 2 weeks. She had no other underlying illness whatsoever. This is a case of throwing away a disabled person." Father Pavone identifies the ethical issue at the heart of the matter. Can someone at a lower level of functioning just be starved to death? Under a right conception of positive law, that its validity and binding character depend upon its conformity to the natural law, with man's participation in the eternal law, the answer must be in the negative. The Schiavo case illustrates perfectly why this is so. Let's look a little more closely at the facts of the case. Her life had been sustained for almost 15 years by so-called artificial hydration and nutrition. And her ordeal began on February 25th, 1990, when her husband called 911 in the middle of the night to advise that he had heard a thump and found his wife unconscious in the bathroom. And while Teresa was resuscitated successfully by paramedics, she suffered severe anoxic ischemic encephalopathy, or massive brain damage, caused by the cessation of the flow of oxygenated blood to her brain. And although her bodily organs were all functioning and she could live indefinitely on food and water administered through a peg tube, her brain damage had left her unable to communicate orally or move her limbs. She was never, however, brain dead. Quite the contrary, as I noted in one of the amicus briefs that were filed in this case, and I quote, Teresa Marie Schiavo was a profoundly disabled Catholic woman. Yet despite her disability, she responds with smiles, love, and joy at the sight of her mother, tries to vocalize, follows commands, tracks objects, responds to music with laughter, and even cries over a sentimental story from her childhood. One can see all this on videotape today. And that's what I wrote in my Bioethics. The fight for Teresa's life began on May 11, 1998, when her husband, who was by then living with another woman, with whom he would have 2 children out of wedlock while Teresa was still alive, filed a petition before a local probate judge for an order authorizing him as guardian to remove the peg tube so that Teresa, who was unable to feed herself by mouth, could be allowed to die for lack of food and water. And the husband alleged that Teresa was in a persistent vegetative state, or PVS for short, which Florida law defines as, quote, a permanent and irreversible condition of unconsciousness, in which there is the absence of A, voluntary action or cognitive behavior of any kind, B, an inability to communicate or interact purposefully with the environment. And under Florida law, one can make a so-called living will, which could consist of nothing more than a single oral statement directing the withholding of what the statute calls a life-prolonging procedure if one should become incapacitated by PVS or some other end-stage condition, which the statute defines as basically any terminal disease. And life-prolonging procedure is defined to include artificially provided sustenance and hydration, which sustains, restores, or supplants a spontaneous vital function. In other words, food and water by means of a standard peg tube. And the Florida legislature declares that the policy behind this statutory scheme is to ensure that in the event of someone's incapacity, there will be a cessation of life-prolonging medical procedures that may result only in, here's the key language, a precarious and burdensome existence. So in essence, according to the Florida legislature, someone whose existence has become precarious and burdensome may be subjected to passive euthanasia through the withdrawal of food and water, provided by a simple tube in common use throughout the world. And the statute implicitly recognizes what's going on here when it says, in a provision that could be called a disclaimer, quote, nothing in this chapter shall be construed to condone, authorize, or approve mercy killing or euthanasia, or to permit any affirmative or deliberate act or omission to end life, other than to permit the natural process of dying, end quote. And in this case, the natural process of dying is slow starvation and dehydration until you are dead. Now, under the statute, even a temporarily aphasic and paralyzed stroke victim, who might well recover fully or substantially over time, could direct, again, by a single oral statement, that food and water be withheld, and apparently even intravenous fluids. And it's rather telling that the Florida statute provides, and I quote, the withholding or withdrawal of life-prolonging procedures from a patient, in accordance with any provision of this chapter, does not for any purpose constitute a suicide. But saying doesn't make it so. And yet the statute implicitly recognizes that that is in fact what's going on here in these cases. Suicide. If someone consciously chooses this course of action. Now the probate judge allowed Teresa's estranged husband's petition to proceed under these statutory provisions based on nothing more, as I said, than oral statements. Statements that Teresa allegedly had uttered while watching television, to the effect that if she ever became incapacitated, she did not wish to be, quote, hooked to a machine, unquote. And then an expert was brought in to testify about what that phrase meant. And according to the expert, that phrase, uttered by Teresa Schiavo, reflected, and I quote, underlying values of independence, quality of life, not to be a burden, and so forth. Hooked to a machine means they, referring to young people of Teresa's age, do not want life artificially extended when there is not hope of improvement, end quote. And that was the expert opinion, on the basis of which Teresa was ultimately put to death. The probate judge viewed quality of life as an important value, as he put it, in assessing whether it was Teresa's wish to be starved or dehydrated to death by removal of the peg tube, some 20 years after her alleged oral remarks. And lost in the shuffle was the fact that use of a peg tube does not amount to being hooked to a machine. as the tube does not require machinery and is routinely used by fully conscious patients to feed themselves. Ironically enough, one source on the internet says that PEG tubes, and I quote, significantly increase the quality of life by maintaining appropriate weight levels and nutritional requirements. But in any case, based on the scanty evidence presented, the probate judge issued an order authorizing removal of the tube, even though Teresa had recovered a malpractice settlement, which was sufficient to provide for her care for the foreseeable future. The judge wasn't deterred by that, however, because as he found, and I quote, initially there is no question that Teresa Schiavo does not pose a burden financially to anyone, and this would appear to be a safe assumption for the foreseeable future. However, the court notes that the term burden is not restricted solely to dollars and cents, since one can also be a burden to others emotionally and physically. End quote. And so began an amazingly complex and hard-fought 7-year legal battle that has no precedent in American history. It included a dozen appeals in the Florida appellate system, one of which I submitted an amicus brief, 5 federal lawsuits, one of which I drafted and argued before the court as co-counsel, the enactment of a special Florida statute called Terry's Law, declared unconstitutional by the Florida Supreme Court, the issuance of a congressional subpoena, a congressional enactment granting the federal court's jurisdiction over Teresa's case to no avail, and no fewer than 4 applications to the United States Supreme Court, all denied without comment by Teresa's parents, by Jeb Bush, then governor of Florida, and by the congressional committee that had issued the subpoena. And in the course of these labyrinthine Florida state court appellate proceedings, the Second District Court of Appeal persisted in the probate judge's original quality of life rationale, holding as follows, that there would be a remand of the case for a hearing, but on this limited issue. Quote, new treatment offers sufficient promise of cognitive function in Ms. Schiavo's cerebral cortex, significantly improving the quality of Ms. Schiavo's life, so that she herself would elect to undergo this treatment and would reverse the prior decision to withdraw life-prolonging procedures. So the court allowed a hearing on whether this new treatment would enhance the function of her cerebral cortex, and whether she would be starved and dehydrated to death depended upon whether the cerebral cortex could be brought up to speed. And Teresa's parents and siblings were never able to meet that burden of proof because their 2 medical experts were outweighed by the 2 medical experts for the husband's side and the tie-breaking expert appointed by the court. So by a vote of 3-2, the experts decided that no, the new treatment would not sufficiently enhance the function of the cerebral cortex. And so the appellate court ultimately concluded, and I quote, Teresa wished to permit the natural death process to take its course and for her family members and loved ones to be free to continue their lives, end quote. The natural death process meaning 2 weeks of slow starvation and dehydration until she was dead. Now, almost a year to the day before Teresa died, Pope John Paul II intervened in the case in a most dramatic way. He all but ridiculed the concept of the persistent vegetative state. In an address to a Vatican medical conference, the Pope observed, and I quote, there are some who cast doubt on the persistence of the human quality itself, almost as if the adjective vegetative, whose use is now solidly established, could or should be applied to the sick as such, actually demeaning their value and personal dignity. And then speaking in opposition to what he called such trends of thought, the Pope said, a man, even if seriously ill or disabled in the exercise of his highest functions, meaning in terms of the brain, the cerebral cortex, is and always will be a man, and he will never become a vegetable. Even our brothers and sisters who find themselves in the clinical condition of a vegetative state retain their human dignity in all its fullness. The loving gaze of God the Father continues to fall upon them, acknowledging them as his sons and daughters, especially in need of help. And then the Pope went on to enunciate explicit moral conclusions which annihilated the entire judicial rationale, according to which this poor woman was being railroaded to her death. And he said, and I quote, "The sick person in a vegetative state, awaiting recovery or a natural end, still has the right to basic health care, nutrition, hydration, cleanliness, warmth, etc., and to the prevention of complications related to his confinement to bed. The administration of water and food, even when provided by artificial means, always represents a natural means of preserving life, not a medical act." And he further added, "The evaluation of probabilities founded on a waning hope for recovery when the vegetative state is prolonged cannot ethically justify the cessation or interruption of minimal care." And then the Pope targeted the quality of life rationale. And what he said about this, clearly with the Florida court system in view, is that, quote, "No evaluation of costs can outweigh the value of the fundamental good which we are trying to protect, that of human life." And he further observed that the very admission into these kinds of decisions of a quality of life calculus, quote, "is the same as acknowledging that increasing and decreasing levels of quality of life, and therefore of human dignity, can be attributed from an external perspective to any subject, thus introducing into social relations a discriminatory and eugenic principle." Now, of course, the teaching of the Roman Pontiff had no impact whatsoever on the legal process that resulted in Teresa's death on the ground that her cerebral cortex was deemed insufficiently functional for an adequate quality of life, in the opinion of an assortment of American jurists, who proceeded inexorably toward final execution of the probate court's original death warrant. 4 days before Teresa breathed her last, Governor Jeb Bush, not by happenstance, a Catholic convert, abandoned his heroic efforts to save her because, as he said, "I cannot violate a court order. I don't have power from the U.S. Constitution, or the Florida Constitution for that matter, that would allow me to intervene after a decision has been made." Yet on the very day of Teresa's death, President Bush, clearly echoing the Pope, issued this statement from the White House: "I urge all those who honored Terry Schiavo to continue to work to build a culture of life, where all Americans are welcomed and valued and protected, especially those who live at the mercy of others. The essence of civilization is that the strong have a duty to protect the weak. In cases where there are serious doubts and questions, the presumption should be in the favor of life." End quote. And on the same day, the Speaker, the then Majority Leader, Tom DeLay, offered the even more remarkable statement, quote, "The time will come for the men responsible for this to answer for their behavior." And at the Vatican, Cardinal Jose Saraiva Martin denounced the passive euthanasia of Teresa Schiavo as, quote, "an attack against God." But in the end, wrote a reporter for the Washington Post, it was an array of federal and state judges spanning the ideological spectrum who declared that what happened here Thursday morning is what Terry Schiavo would have wanted. Which brings me to part two, and I call this part "Overthrowing the Politics of the Soul." And I ask, to begin this section, how is it that despite worldwide outrage, a direct papal intervention, the support of the governor of Florida, the President of the United States, the U.S. Congress, and the House Majority Leader, not to mention the desperate pleas of her parents and siblings, Teresa Schiavo could not be rescued from the clutches of some American judges and their strange fixation on Teresa's cerebral cortex, even though, as the President said, the essence of civilization was at stake. Now, the answer to this question is rather more profound than judicial tyranny, or the usual libertarian complaint about the supposed subversion of the illusory Jeffersonian ideal of limited government. The answer to the question is ultimately neither legal or political, but theological, as it is with any question of importance for our society. The fate of Teresa Schiavo leads naturally into a discussion of the reigning errors of our age. Henry Edward Cardinal Manning once observed that all human differences are ultimately religious ones. And this is a truth that even secular reason is forced to recognize. As the Satan-worshipping anarchist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon admitted in his Confessions of a Revolutionary, quote, "It is surprising to observe how constantly we find that all our political questions involve theological ones," end quote. And replying to him, that great Catholic counter-revolutionary of the mid-19th century, Don Juan Donoso Cortez, wrote, "There is nothing in this to cause surprise, except to be the surprise of Proudhon. Theology, being the science of God, is the ocean which contains all the sciences, as God is the ocean in which all things are contained." Now these days, it does not take a particularly active cerebral cortex to figure out that our nation and the entire Western world is in the midst of a terminal civilizational crisis. And the manifestations of that crisis in the law, like all other aspects of the crisis, including the economic meltdown, have been developing for a long time. But they all proceeded, I would maintain, from a theological decision made some 250 years ago. And that was the decision to reject definitively the fundamental theological premise that an almighty and eternal God has revealed himself and given us his law in the person of Jesus Christ, not only to save souls, but to elevate the socio-political order. So that what confronts us now is the prospect of life in a terminal civilization that has rejected the ancient dictum enforced throughout the West for more than 1,000 years, that Christianity is the law of the land, as Christopher Dawson puts it. And as Dawson says, we are now witnessing, quote, "the reversal of the spiritual revolution which gave birth to Western culture, and a return to the psychological situation of the old pagan world." Now here the glib liberal will say something about rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. But we'll forget to mention that Caesar too, above all Caesar, must render unto God what is his. And what Caesar is refusing to render unto God in the modern state system is the theological problem behind legalized abortion, the judicially sanctioned death of Teresa Schiavo, and the debate over something called the quality of life. The spiritual revolution that Dawson speaks of began actually 400 years before the Incarnation, when for the first time in Western history, the art of politics, especially the law, was understood to be directed to the good of man's immortal and spiritual soul. It was the Greeks, as Dawson notes, who, quote, "created the Western idea of man," and that conception of humanist culture, which has become one of the formative elements in the European tradition, end quote, but which, as I will show, has completely lost today. And that tradition, under its political aspect, can be called the politics of the soul. Of all a man has, says Plato's Athenian in the Laws, the divinest thing, the most truly his own, is his soul. Nothing born of earth is more honorable than the heavenly, and he that conceits himself of the soul otherwise than this knows not the preciousness of this possession he despises. It was Plato who first proposed, therefore, that the citizen in the rightly ordered state has a duty to, quote, "keep himself from all the legislative lists in his count of things base and bad, in order to avoid what the Republic derides as a well-fed city of pigs, and to prevent what Plato called the deformity of the finest thing he has, his soul." With Plato and Plato's Socrates, politics becomes, for the first time, the care of the soul, and the law obtains a medicinal and not really a peacekeeping function, that being the promotion of virtue in a soul that is rightly ordered according to justice, like the rightly ordered state. And carried forward into the metaphysics of Aristotle as the substantial form of man, the soul becomes the center of a teleological ethics of virtue, and its ascent up the ontological ladder of goods toward the highest good for man, which is eternal beatitude, becomes nothing less in Catholic teaching than the final end of politics, involving the close cooperation of temporal and spiritual authority. And so we see Pope St. Pius X declaring in his encyclical Via Mentor Nos the following: That the state must be separated from the church is a thesis absolutely false, a most pernicious error. It limits the action of the state to the pursuit of public prosperity during this life only, which is but the proximate object of political societies. And it occupies itself in no fashion with their ultimate object, and this even Plato can see, which is man's eternal happiness after the short life shall have run its course. Now, this ultimate object of political societies in the Greco-Catholic tradition explains why, when it came time to complete the overthrow of the church's influence over the state, the entire Aristotelian Thomistic system had to be overthrown as well. As the French political philosopher Pierre Menant explains, the principles of classical antiquity were not sufficient for gaining the secular world's independence from the church. Aristotle interpreted human life in terms of goods and ends, all organized in a hierarchy. By presenting human life as a hierarchy of goods and ends, Aristotle's teaching was vulnerable to the Christian claim that the good brought by the church is greater. The end it reveals is higher than any merely natural good or end. This is why the greatest Aristotelian after Aristotle was a doctor and saint of the church, Thomas Aquinas. And what liberty required, this thing we call liberty, modern man's conception of freedom, what it required, as Menant writes, was an unprecedented combination that would allow man to erect a new world to inhabit. Neither this world nor the other world, but a third world, or a third city that is neither natural like the city of the Greeks, nor supernatural like the city of Christians, but simply and purely human, the city of man. And this new creation, this new city, by its very constitution, he writes, must prevent the individual from being claimed by either the old city or the old church. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the society in which we live. The founders of classical liberalism, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, following along the path opened up by the Cartesian cogito, would formally create the ground we now know as secular society. As John Milbank, the Anglican scholar, puts it, once there was no secular. Instead, there was the single community of Christendom, with its dual aspects of sacerdotium and rendium. The secular, as a domain, had to be created or imagined in both theory and in practice. Now, in order to accomplish this immense task of the imagination, Hobbes and Locke deconstructed Greco-Catholic man, the man of the Western tradition, but only partially, and then rebuilt him according to what would become the new order, a government arising from a social contract in a hypothetical and theologically untenable state of nature that has no concern with the soul, but only with maintaining civil peace and the exercise of rights, including the Lockean novelty of the right of self-ownership, in which man becomes his own possession. And this great liberal project had to result in a frontal attack on Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysics, and in particular, the conception of man as substance, as a subsisting unity of body and soul, irrevocably ordered to certain ends and goods, the highest of which is eternal beatitude. And this is why, as Menant points out, quote, whether a substance, substantial form, placed in a hierarchy of substances and forms, or a nature that once animal and rational in a hierarchy of natures, it is the teaching of Aristotle, which was essentially adopted by Catholic doctrine, that Descartes, Hobbes, and Locke will implacably destroy. And as he further notes, it is in England, in the thought of Hobbes and Locke, that the destruction of substance was linked most clearly and most closely to the construction of the new body politic, the new world of human liberty. And it was that world in which the death of Teresa Schiavo was possible. Now, of course, Hobbes, if you've read him at all, denied outright the existence of a spiritual soul in man. But the always prudently subversive Locke, rightly dubbed the Moses of the Enlightenment by Peter Gay, merely called the spiritual soul into question. He said we really can't know anything of the natures or substances of beings. We can only know their nominal essences, which is basically the mind's assembly of the physical attributes that present themselves to our sense, to our senses. The concepts of substance, accident, genus, and species are, according to Locke, and I quote, the workmanship of man. We made it all up. It's a product of the schools. But then the Catholic will ask, how do we know what man is? Is not Locke, by attacking the whole idea of a human substance or nature, calling into question human identity itself? And the answer is, yes, he is. As he says in his essay concerning human understanding, which contributed more to a lack of understanding than any document in history, probably, Locke says, nay, even in substances where their abstract ideas seem to be taken from the things themselves, they are not constantly the same. No, not in that species which is most familiar to us, meaning us, and with which we have the most intimate acquaintance. It having been more than once doubted whether the fetus born of a woman were a man, even so far that it has been debated whether it were or not to be nourished and baptized. So here's John Locke calling into question human identity to the extent of raising, by an eerie anticipation, an argument in favor of abortion. And Thomas Hobbes did the same thing in his De Corpore Politico, where he was even more explicit. Quote, every man, by the law of nature, hath right of property to his own body. The child ought rather to be the property of the mother, of whose body it is part, till the time of separation, than of the father. End quote. Written more than 300 years ago. So we see that ideas have consequences, even if those consequences take quite a while to manifest themselves in social order. Now, hand in hand with this denial of man as substance, with a living and immortal soul, is Locke's denial that the natural law is written on the soul. And so in his essay on human understanding, Locke, like Hobbes, flatly denies that there was any rule of conduct imprinted on the mind as a duty. You see where this is leading in terms of quality of life issues. For Locke, there was imprinted on man only a desire of happiness and an aversion to misery. Because in Locke's view, God has forged no link between his law and the intrinsic natures of the beings he has created. We see in his thought nothing less than what J.B. Schneewin has called the collapse of modern natural law, unquote, in the thought of John Locke. And Locke, no less than Hobbes, is taking the voluntarist position that God's will alone is the origin of moral attributes. But as John Rist has noted, a philosopher from the University of Toronto who's done some superb work in this area, you can't simultaneously assert the existence of a personal and loving God while denying that he has written his moral precepts onto man's very being. And so Locke and Hobbes alike, as Rist says, by denying morality any basis, render God a stranger to man. And from this point, says Rist, we move fast to an irrelevant God, and eventually to his elimination as superfluous. So the God who exists only as a prop for morality somewhere up there and out there soon becomes irrelevant, unless his law is reflected in our nature and is in fact inscribed divinely in our nature. So with the soul effectively decommissioned as an object of politics, Locke easily reaches a conclusion that is contrary to the entire Greco-Catholic tradition, that government exists, as he says, only for the procuring, preserving, and advancing of civil interests, life, liberty, health, and indolency of body. And the sole reason for political society for leading the state of nature, according to Locke, is, quote, the temporal good and outward prosperity of society. And all civil authority, he says, is bounded and confined to only the care of promoting these things. Now, Locke, ever the prudent one, dutifully utters the expected pious sentiment that there is nothing in this world that is of any consideration in comparison with eternity. But as Ralph Hancock has said, the practical upshot of his argument is that there is nothing in eternity worthy of any consideration by government. On close inspection, says Hancock, Locke's elevation of religious affairs to another world may look like a relegation. And that's exactly what it is. The relegation of man's eternal destiny to the level of a private opinion. And that is the fundamental problem that plagues us today. In a political society organized only for the good of the body, in which political authority is supreme and unchallenged by any religion, we can see where the law will lead when the body fails and its continued existence is perceived to burden the exercise of the bodily rights of others. And with the soul decommissioned, and man's final end no longer in view as an object of politics, this Lockean notion of rights, which he reduces to the pursuit of happiness through the relief of uneasiness, is, as Venant observes, severed from being, and thus lacks ontological density. Yet, as he goes on to say, this idea of rights will irresistibly conquer the political and moral realms, since available and unattached, it can easily be tied to the various experiences of man that all appear capable of being looked at in its terms. All the desires of nature, like all the commandments of the law, can be looked at without violence or artifice in terms of human rights. If a man has a right to life, he also has a right to die. If a woman has a right to a child, she also has the right to an abortion. There is nothing under the sun or moon that is not susceptible of becoming the occasion and matter of a human right. End quote. Which brings me to the third section of my talk, which I've entitled Death by Locke. We can now more explicitly draw the link between these founding principles of political modernity and the fate of Teresa Schiavo at the hands of the American judicial system. Because there's no denying, as Francis Fukuyama has observed, that the American founding was thoroughly, if not wholly, imbued with the ideas of John Locke. Locke is, as Ken Craycraft has put it, America's philosopher. And our republic, therefore, reflects what Hancock calls, and this is crucial, the Lockean separation of body and soul, from which it follows, as he continues, man can know nothing of happiness, but only of the conditions appropriate to the pursuit of what each man may call happiness. We live, says Hancock, in a Lockean political order, not based on any definite view of the whole or any fixed understanding of the purpose of human life. And there is, he says, no official answer to the most important question: how shall I live? And it was, Hancock concludes, and I quote, the zealous Lockeanism of the American Revolution, which resulted in the relegation of religion from the public to the private realm, in keeping with deep philosophical hostility in the first instance to reveal religion and a veritable anti-theology of the state. So we're able to understand why Teresa Schiavo had to die, despite the support she had from political leaders, including the President of the United States. We understand this once we appreciate that the rules of Lockean politics bind everyone in America, from the most liberal to the most conservative participant in the political process. And if you have trouble accepting that, consider the remarks that the ultra-conservative jurist, perhaps the most conservative jurist in America, made at the Gregorian in 1996. And I'm referring to Justice Antonin Scalia of the United States Supreme Court. As he declared during the question and answer session following his prepared remarks, and I quote, "It is the job of the state to take care of the natural man, and it is up to religious associations and individuals to take care of the supernatural man." End quote. There we have it, perfectly expressed, the Lockean dualism between the soul and the body of man as the architectonic principle of the modern state system. He embraces it fully. He goes on to say, "It just seems to me incompatible with democratic theory that it's good and right for the state to do something that the majority of the people do not want done. If the people, for example, want abortion, the state should permit abortion in a democracy. If the people do not want it, the state should be able to prohibit it as well." Now, he was confronted by a rather incredulous questioner in the audience who wanted to know how Justice Scalia could reconcile his position with the duty of men to follow the natural law. And Scalia replied, this is published in Origins magazine for anyone else to read, "My only authority as a judge to prevent the state from doing bad things is the authority that the majority has given to the courts. And what the majority decides shall be the rights of minorities is what their rights are under that legal system." To say, but it is contrary to the natural law, is simply to say that you set yourself above the democratic state and presume to decide what is good and bad in place of the majority of the people. I do not accept that as a proper function. What can one say? Our situation is grave indeed when a Catholic jurist of such stature, whose personal integrity and faith are beyond question, blithely divides man into a natural and a supernatural half, separates the body from the soul as Locke does, and leaves the human substance at the mercy of the majority. On such a view of man, nothing is forbidden in the name of liberty. Dr. Ryback spoke of the problem of a Nazistic obedience to legal authority. Is there really a distinction in principle? Put aside his intentions, which are no doubt good, in principle between the view expressed by Justice Scalia and a Nazistic obedience to legal authority? Is there any ground on which anyone can stand to oppose any decision of the majority once one accepts this principle? And indeed, it was two other Catholic jurists of the first rank on the Supreme Court, Justices Anthony Kennedy and Sandra Day O'Connor, who uttered this classic statement of profound Lockean confusion about the nature of man and the real in general, in their opinion, refusing to overturn Roe versus Wade. Quote, at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. End quote. Now, a defender of this absolutely astounding observation says that it sounds more like a discourse on Spinozan metaphysics than on constitutional jurisprudence. And I agree, but it also sounds like a discourse inspired by the nominalist epistemology of Spinoza's successor in his essay concerning human understanding, namely John Locke. We see again that ideas have consequences, deadly consequences. And this defender of that ridiculous remark about how man has the right to define his own concept of existence is also correct when he says that it is, quote, the essential message of political conservatism, or Jeffersonian conservatism, which is personal liberty. This is what passes for conservatism today. And it should come as no surprise that Jefferson was an avid student of none other than John Locke, and that the Declaration of Independence, as the Catholic historian Donald Elliott notes, is a, quote, transcript of Locke's partisan 17th century Whig political theory. So, to sum up this point, within the Lockean framework, that is the modern state system, a deontological conception of rights lacking any foundation in the immutable natural law, divinely inscribed in the human soul, leaves the content of rights entirely under the control of electoral majorities and the judges who interpret their will. And this is the anti-theology of the American state that led to the death of Teresa Schiavo. And since Terry was deemed to own her body without encumbrance by its ensoulment and eternal destiny, she was also deemed by the Florida legislature to have the right to dispose of her body by an alleged advance directive that she be starved and dehydrated to death. I think of the pop song of the 60s. It's my body and I'll die if I want to. Die if I want to. Die if I want to. You would die too if it happened to you. That's the philosophy at work in the death of Teresa Schiavo. And it depends upon the separation of the body and the soul, and the separation of God's law from its status as a thing inscribed in the human soul. Because if you separate the law from nature, you end up with a voluntarist God who recedes further and further from the scene and a deteriorating understanding of nature, such that nature is reduced to the body. And the result is the culture of death. Which brings me to the final part of my talk. Standing up to the dictatorship of relativism. Only days before he was elected to the papacy, Joseph Ratzinger said this in his homily as Dean of the College of Cardinals. We are building a dictatorship of relativism that does not recognize anything as definitive and whose ultimate goal consists solely of one's own ego and desires. End quote. Allow me to say that this dictatorship of relativism is not really under construction, but was in fact completed and given a certificate of occupancy 250 years ago. An historian of the age of democratic revolution as prominent as R.R. Palmer puts the matter this way. As for the leaders of the American Revolution, it should be unnecessary to demonstrate that most of them were deists. Like Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, they appealed to the laws of nature's God. They seem not to have felt, however, that these laws place serious limits on their freedom of political action. Which is what happens with nature's God, who is not the personal God, the indwelling Holy Trinity, which Jefferson, of course, completely rejected. But not all of the founders were deists. One of the most orthodox Christians among them was Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, member of the Continental Congress, the most eminent American physician of his day. And here's what he said in a letter to Timothy Pickering, who would serve as Secretary of State under Presidents Washington and Adams. And he wrote this in 1798, only a few years after the Constitution and Bill of Rights were ratified. But alas, my friend, I fear all our attempts to produce political happiness by the solitary influence of human reason will be as fruitless as the search for the philosopher's stone. It seems to be reserved to Christianity alone to produce universal, moral, political, and physical happiness. Reason produces, it is true, great and popular truths, but it affords motives too feeble to induce mankind to act agreeably to them. Christianity unfolds the same truths and accompanies them with motives agreeable, powerful, and irresistible. And then the prophecy that we had seen fulfilled. Rush writes, I anticipate nothing but suffering to the human race while the present systems of paganism, deism, and atheism prevail in the world. End quote. Written in 1798. Gordon Wood, the great historian of the American Revolution, notes that many of the founders of the Second Reich ended up by abandoning the Enlightenment, as he puts it, and becoming a Christian enthusiast. And I ask, can we contemporary Catholics, with the benefit of long and bitter experience with the results of Enlightenment liberalism in practice, do anything less than Rush did? Can we do anything less than Orestes Brownson did when the scales fell from his eyes 135 years ago? He was once an Americanist. He gave up on the idea of reconciling the American ideal with the Catholic ideal, and he wrote this to Isaac Hecker just after the Civil War. Where the people are Catholic and submissive to the law of God as declared and applied by the Vicar of Christ and Supreme Pastor of the Church, democracy may be a good form of government. But combined with Protestantism or infidelity in the people, its inevitable tendency is to lower the standard of morality, enfeeble intellect, abase character, retard civilization, as even our short American experience amply proves. Our republic may have had a material expansion and growth, but every observing and reflecting American whose memory goes back as mine does over 50 years sees that in all else it is tending downward and is on the declivity to utter barbarism. If he could see that in 1867, how can we not see that today? How can we not see the end result of the principles that political modernity accepts as received wisdom? When our Pope lamented only a couple of months ago that, quote, nations once rich in faith and vocations are now losing their identity under the harmful and destructive influence of a certain modern culture, one wished that he would have said something more about that certain modern culture. One wished that the Pope would have stated explicitly that it is the same culture now dominant in every Western nation, which embodies in its laws and institutions principles condemned in the Syllabus Aurorum, promulgated by his beatified predecessor, Pius IX, whose pastoral staff, surely a message is intended here, Pope Benedict now carries. Is there some reason, I ask, why in the midst of the worst socio-political debacle in Western history, churchmen can no longer identify and condemn explicitly the social, political, and philosophical errors that so alarmed a long line of popes before the Second Vatican Council? To finish up, I'll offer a few suggestions by way of a conclusion. For starters, as things fall apart all around us, it is long past time for Catholics to admit the correctness of the conclusion that Alistair McIntyre expressed 12 years ago. Quote, "The moral presuppositions of liberal modernity, whether in its theory or in social institutions, are inescapably hostile to Christianity, and all attempts to adopt Christianity to liberal modernity are bound to fail." With reference to ethics in particular, I would suggest that there is no hope, and never was, for any sort of dialogue to devise a project of rationalist ethics arrived at through conversations with non-believers. Because you'll never end up with anything more than a prudential ought. And a prudential ought in a democracy is nothing more than a consensus subject to revocation at the next election, as we have just seen. And let's be realistic enough to recognize that, as Grist has written, moral obligation, the only obligation clearly separable from prudence or enlightened self-interest, is a utopian dream in a non-theistic universe. In vain are the attempts of theists to deny this in the hope of persuading secular moralists that the debate between them can be resolved in purely this worldly terms. And by all means, let us stop talking about rights. At his address at Harvard in 1978, Alexander Solzhenitsyn made precisely that point. 5 years after abortion was legalized in this country, throughout the nation. He said this to a stunned Harvard audience, which nevertheless gave him a round of applause for this statement. "The defense of individual rights has reached such extremes as to make society as a whole defenseless against certain individuals. It is time in the West to defend not so much human rights as human obligations." The Bible, notes Tracy Brolin, has never heard of rights in the Lacan sense. And I would ask how it is that Catholics have allowed themselves to be boxed into ethical debates conducted entirely on the basis of a term that appears absolutely nowhere in the revealed truth about morality. And the problem with rights, of course, is that rights are personal possessions. They belong to the possessor. The possessor can relinquish them, modify them, give them up, redefine them, add to them, or subtract from them, because they belong to him. They're not owed to God. Those duties, of course, are owed to God. And for that matter, we should abandon the very term quality of life in conducting this debate and speak only of the sanctity of life in ethical and legal discussions. Because the sanctity of life has nothing to do with its quality, whereas the quality of life can only refer to the condition of a body considered apart from the soul. And anyone who saw the videos of Teresa's shadow could see that within that damaged body, a radiant soul was responding to the love of those who cared for her and to the grace of God. If you saw the pictures and the videos of that woman, you saw the radiance of the soul that I believe was in the state of grace. To harken back to the remarks by the Cardinal, she lived long enough to become a saint, in spite of the efforts to murder her, which were ultimately successful. Aside from these suggestions, I have to say that there's going to come a time for each of us when it will be necessary to engage in acts of Catholic resistance to the demands of the dictatorship of relativism, or else we will fall into a culpable capitulation to evil. And if our civilization is to survive, and we are talking about the survival of our situation, Dr. Craig spoke of repent or survive as choice number one, then we will have to fulfill our duty before God not to obey or to apply to others any law, regulation, or constitutional provision that contravenes the natural or eternal law. And I would ask what excuse any Catholic has for declining to live according to the truth penned by Martin Luther King from his Birmingham jail cell. "One has a moral responsibility," King wrote, "to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas," said this Protestant minister from his Birmingham jail cell, "an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law." That is what we Catholics must begin to say. We're going to be successful in this debate. We're going to have any chance to win. And if civil disobedience was justified to end the evil of segregation, how can any Catholic justify civil quiescence in the face of the systematic mass extinction of innocent life in the color of law, much less approve it as an outcome that even Catholics must accept within a democratic framework. Only the Catholic Church, as we see in these statements of John Paul II, continues to teach forcefully and unambiguously on these difficult questions of moral theology. Only the Church. And what this means finally is that we must recognize that our hope for survival as a civilization depends upon nothing less than a corporate and social metanoia. Yes, I'm talking about a reconversion of the Western world to the Catholic faith, precisely as Father Aidan Nichols has suggested for the salvation of a decadent and dying England in his essay on this subject which just came out. And Catholics who say that such a prospect is unrealistic and that we have no choice but to continue our dialogue with the modern world have to answer this question. What is more unreal than the situation in which we find ourselves today? Is it not the result of what Cornelio Ferrara, the great Thomist scholar, has called the indifferent neglect of being that began some 250 years ago? The argument that the reconversion of the West is unrealistic is, in my view, nothing but a Pelagian concession, the exploration of Western civilization in an ontological vacuum. We should look instead to such examples of what could happen. Nicaragua's repeal of its liberal abortion law, which was made possible because Daniel Ortega, a communist, converted, came back to the church, and led the parliament of that country to an all but unanimous vote, completely abolishing legalized abortion in Nicaragua. Now surely, given the infinite power of divine grace, we can advocate something more for the vast body of hundreds of millions of Catholics, baptized Catholics in the Western world, than simply allowing it to remain tied to the ground by the Lilliputian strings of Enlightenment liberalism. Those strings would snap in an instant if only the dormant church militant would exert itself everywhere, as it has in Nicaragua and in other small nations, which are still Catholic and are fighting a rearguard action against the new order of the ages. Lastly, when all is said and done, we need only to understand our situation in order to overcome it. Speaking of our time as the new Dark Ages, MacIntyre rightly concludes, as I will conclude, that if the tradition of the virgins was able to survive the horrors of the last Dark Ages, we are not entirely without grounds for hope. This time, however, the barbarians are not waiting beyond our frontiers. They have already been governing us for quite some time. And it is our lack of consciousness of this that constitutes our predicament. We are waiting not for Godot, but for another and doubtless very different St. Benedict. Thank you.
Speakers who took the time and gave of their expertise at this conference, and I want to thank them from the bottom of my heart. I'd also like to thank all of you for coming today, to open up this conversation, to continue this conversation about the issues of the day and how we can think about them and react to them as good Catholics. I would ask you to do one more thing before we call it a day, because it's been a long, but I think very excellent day. There is a evaluation form in your folders. If you could take the time to fill those out and to just